Good
Evening.
morning, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Just like as Paul says, it's me, the majestic ape, and I'm online with the main man, London Paul, who's joining us for another edition of his extravagant Monday morning show, where we're going to run down the entire world events, what's going on, what's really important. CJ's on deck. He's making sure that the airways are coming out beautifully, and I'm just sitting here worrying about how much bread and how much milk I have to buy because it turns out this morning I found out that we're going to get walloped by a blizzard. So with that being said, Paul, how are you, buddy?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. And yourself?
I'm hanging in there, man. I mean, my God, I mean the I mean, apart from the bread and milk situation, no, the all the things that are going on in this world, especially with the deep state and all the moves that are happening. I mean, you you have Erdogan threatening the Netherlands with a bob on kebab with a ban on kebabs. So I don't know where all this stuff is going, Paul.
Right, well, just good morning, Eddie. Obviously, afternoon, evening to everyone listening. Yeah, we could start with what's going on with Turkey and Holland. Obviously, there was two Turkish ministers were planning campaign rallies for because obviously in Turkey they got the April the 16th constitutional referendum in Turkey that everyone's going, well, it's going to expand the president's powers. Well, let's park that because it doesn't really matter. And obviously, citing these security worries, that Turkish political divisions might spill into this Turkish minority communities. That's the Dutch government quote, by the way. They blocked the Turkish foreign minister, if I can pronounce his name right, Cavusoglu, I think it is, from landing in Rotterdam. And then they stopped the family minister from entering the Turkish consulate, and they drove her to the Dutch border and actually said, well, Germany, you can deal with her instead, which is a bit bizarre. Now, to put some context in this, obviously, in Holland, they've got a population, I think it's about 400,000 people of Turkish origin, and Germany's got probably about 1.5 million, something like that. Now, from my perspective, I think, irrespective of how Erdogan's reacted, it's a complete overreaction by the Dutch government. And one suspects, given the Dutch elections are happening on the 15th, they thought it might be a good idea to start trying taking a hardline approach to this situation. Now, of course, on the flip side, you've got Wilders, who's probably likely to be the biggest single party. No, I don't think he'll probably get enough seats to form a government. And then there's the whole issue. Well, is anyone going to want to form, a coalition government with him? Well, probably not. But he's going to say, well, look, you're finally doing what I've been saying, and if you're just trying to seek political capital because you want to try and win the election on Wednesday. And then, of course, yeah, Erdogan's reacted by saying, it's completely unacceptable. He referred to Holland as a banana republic and said about Nazism spreading in the West. And of course, the Dutch Prime Minister is completely in horror about this, demanding an apology, and there won't be an apology. And bear in mind that Holland and Turkey are both NATO members, and he's not going to apologise for rejecting the border entry of the Turkish ministers. Now, of course, it's boiled over into Turkey as well. So in the capital Ankara and at the consulate in Israel, there's been in Istanbul, there's been all these protests outside Dutch embassies, and it's all getting completely blown out of proportion. Germany's joining in, saying, well, we're going to prevent Turkey's political tensions from spreading into Germany, so they're going to call off rallies there. And then France is going, well, we actually don't care, and if you want to have rallies, so be it, and let's diffuse the situation. Now, it just seems the timing, as ever with all these things, is just, to me, seems like it's just a political stunt to try and rally support prior to the election. But of course, the situation is, what are the ramifications going to be? It's another example where if they seriously wanted Turkey to join the European Union, whether it fails tomorrow or doesn't, and Turkey strategically, as we know, is very important to the powers that were. They're doing a
Right.
great job in persuading Erdogan that he doesn't want anything to do with the European Union. But of
I love
course,
what you said.
the
The
big problem
power.
you have is the number of Turkish people in Holland, and what is there going to be some backlash? And that would be of a concern, and something that the Dutch government doesn't seem to have paid any attention to. And it does seem largely ridiculous, and it's completely disproportionate. If they just let these ministers in, let them do what they want to do, it would have nothing would have happened. And now they've created this huge, and I'll use the word shitstorm because it is, and it's just absolutely farcical.
I think it's hilarious because when you look at these all of a sudden the Dutch politicians want to act like they have a spine. It's too little, too late. Whether Wilders wins the parliamentary elections wins becomes prime minister of in Holland, it's irrelevant at this point because um, the cat's out of the bag. There's such a push that's happening not only in the Netherlands but also throughout. You see it in Germany, you see it in France with Le Pen. This push for nationalism, it's really blown up in their face. And I love what you said, Paul. The powers that were.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, it is, and of course but we're back to this situation. The more they do what they do, all they're doing is encouraging nationalism in nations. Whatever that turns out to be in the future remains to be seen. But you're right. The same in France. It's the same, obviously, in Holland. You've got the elections, obviously, on Wednesday there, and you're seeing moves across Europe where there's huge resistance. I mean, we've talked about Poland, and that carries on. Poland's is getting really fed up. They're talking about every end and turn. They're looking at, well, does this benefit us to be part of this arrangement, and are we happy with this anymore? And there's consternation inside the country itself where constitutionally they're changing things, and the EU's going, you can't do this. You've got likes of Austria and Hungary who are railing against the sanctions. You've got Hungary saying we've had enough of all the NGOs and Soros's meddling in our country, and the list goes on and on. And the European Union is just in this slow free fall collapse. I mean, it's happening. You can almost see it collapsing pretty slowly, but it is on a week by week basis now. Of course, people will say, well, if Wilders doesn't get elected, it's the death of nationalism. It's the death of this obstruction towards the European Union. Well, it isn't, and it's largely irrelevant. And he probably will become the biggest single party, but who knows what might happen? We may wake up on the 16th and have a Brexit type or Trump shock, even though it wasn't a shock to some of us. But right. I probably doubt it will happen in that regard. But he's certainly going to shake up the political establishment. And in truth, he does express some pretty extreme views that a lot of people will find offensive. If people think Trump's offensive, then some of the stuff he's come out with, people will find offensive. So they'll really have something to moan about if he does form a government. And I mean, the question is, if he forms a government outright, then what are the consequences? Well, he's already said, and pulling us out of the European Union. Mm-hmm. But I think that's unlikely. And the problem in Holland, you're going to end up with 3 or 4 parties likely to have to form a coalition government. Well, we all know how that works in reality. It just doesn't. Nothing will get done, and it'll be this stagnant process. And probably after 12 months, they'll go, well, let's have another election because this just isn't working. And of course, by then, the political and geopolitical landscape of Europe will probably not be anything like it is now, particularly as the way it's free falling. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the timing, it's like everything in these situations is always, to me, what about the timing? Yeah. Everything always is timing, because these things don't just usually randomly happen. But I think it's actually, ironically, they haven't thought that it's probably good. In some quarters, people will be going, well, they're just doing what Wilders has said. And they may encourage them more to vote Wilders, although they think clearly, oh, well, we're actually encouraging the people to vote for the current government. But I don't think people are going to believe it because they haven't seen this kind of hardline approach, well, since I don't know when.
Yeah, exactly. I think people are smart enough to see that the desperate ploy by the Dutch government. Paul, let me ask you this: France with Le Pen, what's the latest on that?
Well, she seems to be leading the opinion polls at the moment by a thin margin. I mean, and as usual, they're trying to do everything they can to discredit her. Sounds a bit like Trump. They're trying to find every way to find a way of stopping her even standing for the elections. But I mean, will she win? I don't know. I mean, it has the hallmarks of feeling like Trump, but I think probably far more important than the upcoming elections is I mean, this whole immigration issue, however people feel about it, it's starting to reach breaking point in in France, and I suspect that'll be where the dam will break. And then, of course, the big risk is that it will just spread very badly across Europe, and there could be some very nasty consequences. And I mean, we've seen a lot of the footage coming out where there is outright, almost like warfare is not quite the right word, but there's been battles between French nationals and immigrants, and there's been all manner of things reported across the whole European Union about things that have crimes that have happened, etc. So I think that's a big, huge thing that's in the melting pot, and likely to boil over sooner rather than later. And of course, if it does, that just immediately plays straight into Le Pen's hands. So what do they do? I mean, the current French government's caught between a rock and a hard place, because it goes, well, we've had this very soft attitude towards it all, but if we don't deal with it, then something will get out of hand. The French people won't tolerate it, and they absolutely won't tolerate it, and that could then cause a landslide almost towards Le Pen. So they were, and yet that, of course, and if they do something, and of course the French people are going to say, well, hang on, why are you now doing it? It's a bit like what's happening in Holland. They're very skeptical. I mean, Hollande is not standing for the next election, and he's got an opinion rating of, well, probably minus 10%, if that's possible. Nobody likes him, nobody wants him, and that's why he's not standing again. So, yeah, I think that there's a huge melting pot that could come about in the European Union pretty quickly, notwithstanding all the other things that we've talked about and that are ongoing, which is, causing a meltdown. I mean, now the latest thing is the ECB's going, well, actually, we may raise interest rates as well. I mean, just because,
because we feel like
the rate decision.
Because we're completely out of ideas and we have nothing better to do, we've decided to follow the Fed's lead and raise interest rates.
And of course, the thing is that it's like anything. I mean, I did something on one of the podcasts that basically says if they carry on with QE, they're screwed, and if they stop QE, they're screwed. And the point is, if they raise interest rates, they're screwed. I mean, So whatever they do, it doesn't make any difference. And Draghi's thing will do whatever we can. There's nothing they can do anymore. They've wrecked the European Union economies, as we know, and that's a statement of the obvious. But the whole thing is just is meltdown. And of course, we're now starting to see elements within the European Union at each other's throats about it. There's a disagreement on kind of what they should do going forward. I mean, there's this kind of idea: should we have a two-speed European Union? And which arguably isn't a solution, but it would have been better to have tried to do something like that and then have a one-speed. But of course, it's too little, too late, and it's failed. And then you've got Juncker coming out almost inferring, well, when the UK decides to rejoin the European Union in the future, I mean, these people are so out of touch with reality. They have no idea that the European Union is dead and buried, and they seriously think it's going to carry on. It's just, I mean, it's incredulous they even believe this.
It really is. It's like saying, well, when the lifeboats, Paul, decide to return back to the Titanic, we want to make it convenient for them to haul them back up out of the water so they can get back on board with us. And the rest of you on board, we're going to try and upgrade you to first class.
But by the way, that's at the bottom of the ocean. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Oh my God!
But I think if we talk about the European Union, obviously there's the upcoming whole Article 50. Well, invoking it, and just to give a bit of background, obviously Article 50 is the Treaty on the European Union. It says, well, a member state just has to notify the EU of its withdrawal, and obviously then it obliges the EU to negotiate a withdrawal agreement, whatever that means. So obviously any member state can withdraw from the Union, and if it decides to withdraw, it notifies the European Council of its intention, and then everyone's supposed to sit down and behave like sensible adults. And in theory, you can leave from the date of withdrawal, but normally you spend 2 years having some kind of negotiation period, and although you can obviously extend that beyond the 2 years. Now, of course, the thing is, the problem with this agreement is it's not as clear cut, because the European Union says we're going to make it as difficult as possible as we can for the UK in leaving, and the UK is going, well, do you know what, actually, we don't even have to go through Article 50. This is something possibly people aren't aware of. They could just say tomorrow, we're going to withdraw from the EU by repealing, it's called the 1972 European Communities Act.
Yeah.
And they could just say we're walking away. Now, that obviously doesn't make sense, because then all of a sudden Britain's left hanging in limbo with terms of its trade agreements, and also because the UK has to adopt so many European laws, what the hell happens to the legal system? We're kind of stuck in limbo. Well, what laws are we going to abide by? So we have to have this sensible way of leaving and negotiating this settlement. Now, it could be very simple, but also the risk is if you have an agreement that cuts across policy areas, so for example, services, transport, investment, protection, etc., as many of the EU FTAs, the free trade agreements it has with, say, South American nations, that's a mixed agreement, and therefore you have to have every single national parliament in the EU to ratify that. Well, how many points might you have on that? 20, 30 points? Who knows? You're never going to get any agreement on this. So the obvious question then is, well, what's the UK going to do when they're saying, well, we've got a fallback plan that if we can't have an agreement, we'll find some way out of it. Well, I very much doubt that's reality.
Mhm.
And the problem then is, well, what does the UK fall back on? The World Trade Organization rules. If you can't get a free trade agreement with the EU, and well, that's going to cause mayhem to the UK's economy. So it's a complete mess. And now you've got Sturgeon in Scotland going, well, we want another independence vote, and we're going to invoke there's some articles or Section 30 order, which means they can do so. But by the way, we're not going to have this until the autumn of 2018 and the spring of 2019. Well, by then, the European Union probably won't exist in any way, shape, or form, and the UK's exit will become redundant. But it's turned into this gigantic political theatre, and everyone's speculating, well, what's it going to do to the UK economy? Is the pound going to get smashed? Well, the pound's gone up about 0.75% against the dollar today, and also it's up about the same against the euro. And it just means it's all nonsense. It's an irrelevance, and it's grand political theatre. And the reality is, of course, the British leaving the Europe, or stating its intention, was a big, huge milestone in the grand scheme. But its actual process of leaving becomes largely irrelevant because it will turn and degenerate into a mess if the European Union survives. They'll never agree on anything. Well, the simple agreement should be that Britain says, well, Holland, we're going to have a free trade agreement with you, or Germany, or anyone else. But of course, which that would probably be fall into how the WTO stuff works, and that could degenerate into a farce. But in reality, it's become largely an irrelevancy. It makes great political theatre, and everyone will be going, well, the British government's going to have this vote, and people want to preserve some or change some of the articles associated with the Brexit bill, but it doesn't really matter. But it's set against the backdrop. It really has, in essence, it's a bit like Trump. Trump's election isn't just what he's going to do for the US, it's how it starts to geopolitically change the world. And Britain's Brexit vote has had exactly the same effect on the European Union. It gave nations within the European Union the courage to say enough's enough. And for the last, 9 months or so, we're seeing increasingly more and more dissension within the Eurozone against what's going on, because they're starting to see from the discussions and the intransigent attitude with Brussels towards Britain.
Mhm.
Well, this is exactly, all the fears we had are coming to fruition, and we're seeing that that's the reality of it. So that's probably more important in some senses than the actual Brexit kind of approach of how we leave the European Union.
Yeah, absolutely. What's your take on what the Chinese are doing in terms of their maneuvering, and then we can touch base on Russia as well as the whole Middle East situation, how that pertains to the infighting and war that you see, the fratricide that you see here in the U.S. within the deep state over here.
Well, yeah, well, maybe let's start with Russia. I mean, in terms of the Middle East, I think we can start because we can actually, something I had confirmation of, which if you really want to give Netanyahu an aneurysm,
Yeah,
by all
did you
accounts,
see that speech that Netanyahu was giving out in Moscow? I
yeah,
mean,
and of course, yeah, exactly.
where do I
Putin
begin
just
with
turned
that?
around and said, "Well, it doesn't really matter what happened, 500 BC. It's what's going on now that counts." I mean, that's about a diplomatic slap in the face that you could ever give anyone.
It was I mean, Putin has him on a short leash. It's not even funny to say at this point. Paul, it amazes me. I'm listening to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu's opening line is, 2,500 years ago, the Persians, the Persian Empire, tried to kill the children of Israel. like, I'm like, if this is what the foreign policy of some nations are, we're in a lot of trouble. I mean, this is ridiculous. Why don't we have more people getting up there and telling Bible stories, Paul? And in various foreign policy circles, why don't they start quoting Bible stories?
Well,
It's unbelievable.
I don't really know why he even, well, why we said it, but going back to the point, from what I understand, is Assad approved the creation of an Iranian naval base close to the Hamam air base used by Russia's air force in Syria. Now, if that's not going to give Netanyahu an aneurysm, I don't know what is. And
Yep.
that's why Netanyahu went to Moscow, because he went, hang on, he's getting really frightened. And he probably went there saying, well, can you stop this? And Putin sent him home empty-handed and said, no, we're not
Yeah,
doing that
right.
because we can prove for the fact that the Iranians have been fighting very hard to remove the Islamic State, which they have in Syria.
Yeah.
Assad trusts them, the Russians trust them, and they're going to work multilaterally together. But of course, the flip side is that we know that the Russians, the Americans, and the Turkish had a meeting of generals to discuss policy decision in Syria, and we know that we've talked about this before. We've had more confirmation that the US and Russia are working together in many ways in Syria, despite the apparent rhetoric that's going
Hmm.
on that Russia's the sworn enemy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is another move that says to the world, look, stop messing with Iran, stop pretending Iran's the sponsor of worldwide terrorism. It just isn't going to wash.
No, it doesn't
Russia is
work.
our ally, and China's our ally, and so we're working with Assad. We're all allies. We're working together to solve a major problem that you in the West created, not something Iran created.
Yeah. Absolutely correct, man. And I think that's something that it sickens me that you still have this ridiculous axiom floating around the halls of Congress and in Washington D.C. in general. Iran is the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism. I'm like, oh, all right. Well, so what about the Saudis? Nobody mentions the dirty Saudis. Number one, and number two, if you look at what's happening right now with a lot of the deep state with the Western proxies, they are angling in the middle of this whole entire Syria debacle. They are angling for a fight with Hezbollah in Lebanon, which I would dare to venture would say it would absolutely backfire in their faces, Paul, because we've seen what happened in Operation Cast Lead, where Israel went into Lebanon and they will literally have their rear ends handed to them on a silver platter. I don't know what they're trying to accomplish here. In the middle of Trump trying to, smooth relations over with the Russians, and granted, there's some vitriolic, statements back and forth. This whole Iran, you're on notice, and this, that, and the other. I mean, when is this nonsense going to stop?
Well, the thing is, they've gone a bit quieter because Iran's been launching other test missiles, and the notice the US said nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And they were exactly the same missiles that they launched in the first missile, which prompted all the rhetoric about drawing red lines and we're not tolerating it. I mean, it looks to me in terms of the Middle East that Israel feels threatened, backed into a corner because now we're hearing that, and we talk about the Chinese. The Chinese have been very diplomatic in terms of the Middle East. I mean, they're very supportive of Syria. They haven't got any actual official military presence there, but they're very supportive. They're working in terms of economic and bilateral trade with Syria. But now we're hearing that the Chinese very likely are going to also be a broker between solving the major problems, which they do exist, which is Western influence between Saudi and Iran. Now, if that happens, what does Israel do? Israel's completely isolated in terms of its policy because, yes, it wants to form a group of allies and in some way try to broker some influence over Iran. Well, when you get Saudi, who are obviously also angling to be very much on side with Russia because it sees Russia economically to help them solve their massive financial problems. I mean, as we said recently, Saudi's bankrupt. Sounds incredulous, but
Yeah.
I mean, they are literally bankrupt. So they're in no position economically to start to be able to influence anything in the Middle East. So you've got, if Saudi turns on side with Russia and Iran, and then also you've got China, you've got Syria, you can throw Afghanistan into that in that region because they now want Russian assistance to deal with problems in their own nation. They want to form military ties. They want to form bilateral ties. They're also, it's part of the new Silk Road, so you can throw China into that. There's this huge move of nations away from the old kind of Western influence. And what does Israel do? They're backed into a corner, and they, to me, they're the only nation that at the moment that seems to be at all interested in stoking up problems with Iran. I mean, despite the Saudis and the Iranians historically not getting on even in the slightest, there's moves now, and I think also that the Saudis thought that Russia could help broker some talks with the Iranians, and also the Iraqis that the Saudis thought could broker some relations with the Iranians. There's no demand or desire to start stoking up tensions in that region. There's enough problems as it is. And I think it's the further we go, and to all intents and purposes, we're almost on the cusp of seeing the end of ISIS in Syria. I don't want to tempt fate, but they're increasingly marginalized. Region after region is squeezing them out. They seem to have largely moved back into the mountains in Iraq, probably to mobilize and see what they can do. But morale must be horrendous because people are joining and people are dying very, very rapidly.
Yeah.
I mean, at the outset when they marched right across Syria, they had no opposition, but now they're recruiting all these people and they're coming home. Well, most of them probably aren't even going home. They're just disappearing, but presumably dead.
Right.
The morale's back. They're getting their finances cut off as well. They haven't got the financial wherewithal. They're also the other day in Syria, they're starting to cut off a huge truckloads of munitions and weapons and stuff that was supposed to be heading for Daesh. That was stopped. So intelligence is improving. And you can, pardon the pun, bet your bottom dollar the US cooperation in terms of this is starting to come to fruition. And a lot of it is going on. The US doesn't have to be overt. It's like the idea. I mean, I get people saying, well, Trump, he's putting these boots on the ground in Syria. It's the neocon warlords at it again. No, he's promised he wants to get rid of ISIS, and they will do what they can. They're being in a passive role, a supportive role. They're not aggressively going in and telling Assad what to do. There's none of the rhetoric coming out, we want Assad removed. They're working in cooperation with the Russians, with the Iranians, but I mean, largely probably more with Russia, and also to some extent they're having to work in cooperation with Turkey, although that's a bit complicated in terms of what's going on in northern Syria. But the whole map's changed, and people are still framing everything in reference to the old days, like it's the Bush era, and they're going into countries doing what they're doing. Absolutely not anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think, I mean, look at what's happening in Iraq, where the leader of the ISIS operations in Iraq are saying that, basically, you touch base on the funding. This leader says, we have no money to fight. If you want, go do martyrdom attacks and do suicide attacks against the enemy because we have no reinforcements. So it's gotten to that level of desperation, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you can factor in, of course, that Trump's whole phone conversations with the Palestinian president, Abbas. And I think that the Americans' angle now is it's a two-state solution. And I'm sorry, Israel, and I'm sorry, Palestine, but you're going to both grow up and you're going to find a solution, and it's going to happen. And we're not having any excuses anymore. There's going to be a resolution to this. And that's very much privately what I understand is going on. That's a huge sea change. Because I think the reality is that is the only option. What else are you going to do? I mean, there's all this idea we can formulate all these other ideas, but I think privately the US is beginning to lose patience. So when you factor that all in, the whole kind of Middle East picture's changing. And now, of course, we can go on to the whole ongoing stuff with Russian attempts to meddle in the US presidential elections, and the Democrats are now saying, well, we think we're going to withdraw from this because it's not credible. They refer to it as a dog and pony show that with no serious effort to do an investigation. No, the reality is the investigation's proving it's absolute nonsense. I mean, the UK is now going, well, we have to admit the Russians aren't meddling. The Germans have said, no, the Russians aren't meddling. What are they supposed to say in the US? Yes, the Russians are meddling. And of course, the WikiLeaks revelation, which, from my perspective, telling us they're bugging TVs and iPhones, Androids, laptops, and every other electronic device isn't the news. The news is the timing again. Now, we have Trump making reference to wiretapping, and then this comes out.
Perfect timing.
What's the coming? Yeah. And I suspect, I mean, this information's been hanging around for, well, how long have they had it in this vault? We don't know, but a considerable period of time. They suddenly release it now. And of course, who is on the receiving end of all this? The CIA, clearly. And it's exposing the fact that the CIA can use signatures that the Russians would use to make it look like the Russians are hacking. So ergo, therefore, Russia's trying to hack and influence the US presidential elections and everything else, and the spurious reasons on that basis to try and indirectly investigate Trump. Well, The reality is it came out because somebody is not happy with progress made with the CIA,
Uh-huh.
because we know that Trump has the CIA chained to his desk. So the question is, okay, who's not making the necessary progress? Who's not actually playing ball with us to make the changes? Because the CIA has to be changed from top to bottom, or as to coin the phrase, a wrecking ball needs applying to that. Someone's obviously said, "Hang on, this isn't good enough. We're not having enough progress. Right, get this information out. Let's start destroying the credibility of the CIA." And you can guarantee, if the progress isn't made, you'll see more WikiLeaks revelations. Yeah, I mean, they said we've released 1% of the information. Well, maybe
Wow.
that's an exaggeration, or maybe it isn't. But I think you'll find if the CIA don't start to play ball, then you'll see a situation where more information will come out, which will discredit their organization. And there's one thing that there was left out regarding the CIA, and we talk about the fact that they're bugging everything, and they've been listening into every nation's conversations, and probably every account. They're not that interested in people like you and me, because we talk what we're saying. What are we actually going to say in emails, and why would they bug us? No point. The one thing the CIA have done, which is probably not known, is that they've had massive infiltration of the internet. And people say, well, why would that be? Well, I mean, indirectly, they wanted to control the mass media, the financial system, the political system, everything. And we think they're not interested in subverting information. I mean, the internet's another medium of information. So they will flood the internet with a lot of information. They'll put a lot of people on there to subvert opinion, to change people's perspective, and to skew the reality. So because that's the one medium that has brought out a lot of truth. Okay, there's a lot of bullshit on it as well, but there is a lot of truth that's come out. And they have subverted that for a long time, which is skewing the perspective of things and skewing our understanding of the reality. And of course they've done that. And at some point that reality will have to come out, because it's important that there are people out there and there's large groups. I mean, they've had it in China, where probably CIA operatives, want of a better word, tried to infiltrate Chinese internet. People don't think that China has an internet. Well, actually they do, and they have social networks. Yes, they do, and they were trying to subvert it, and that was CIA operatives. So if people think it doesn't happen in West, it absolutely does. So the question then is, well, what does that do in terms of the information's out there and how it's being skewed, and what's that done to many people's perspective on things for the last, well, however long they've done it, probably a decade or so, maybe longer.
Hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. Also, like you see how rapidly already John McAfee from McAfee virus fame has already come out with countermeasures to this snooping, and already, like, I've heard from Apple, they're already working on to further encrypt their iPhones and their iOS devices from snooping, because it's also a security breach for companies like that, because
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's and right now so many programmers and developers are already working on this, and there's going to be a burgeoning market for this type of privacy tech, and newer stages of encryption and things of that sort. WhatsApp, you look at Signal, you look at some of these companies, they have come out already with patches to ensure against this. So this is a big major thing for them to for this Volt 7. The ramifications it has on the snooping, it's completely neutered the CIA and the NSA in a lot of regards, their ability to look into these devices.
Yeah, I mean, and the important thing is that it's good that people are aware that there are flaws in technology. The biggest problem, of course, they always have, all these companies, and of course they've had to be very reactive to it, is the agencies are probably 5 or 6 steps ahead, and whatever they think, gaps they're plugging holes in, there are other holes they're not even aware of. And this is how the whole kind of situation, it might be to do with cybercrime, or they're always light years ahead. I can remember when chip and pin came out, and they were rubbing their hands going, well, you've just given us an easy route for us to commit more acts of fraud. So it's the same in all these environments. The people who run it, whether we despise them is not the issue. The issue is there's some very, very intelligent people who are very capable of bypassing things, and they're always 10 steps ahead. And these companies, as you've listed, are now going, well, we've got to do something about it. But the biggest problem is, are they just playing catch up, or are they ever going to get on top of it? And at some point, I think they probably will, because there'll be a global coordinated effort to stop this kind of thing happening, because it will need to be that way. But at the moment, they're playing serious kind of levels of catch up, and it's difficult for them to know exactly what exactly are they trying to protect us from. I mean, it's like an enemy, you don't know what it is, and you've got no idea what, keys and inverted commas that they've got to open back doors into their systems. It's a
Yeah.
hugely complicated problem.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what a lot of, I agree with what a lot of people have been saying. The moves that are done by the CIA and the NSA snooping, it serves two purposes. Of course, it's the military industrial complex, but also it's financial espionage. This is the best way for these guys to get the inside track on what foreign companies are doing, and then feed that back to, some of their Wall Street masters, you know?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we talked about this quite a lot in the past. Cybercrime is going to be a huge problem in the future, and it's something that every nation's going to address, because even when the cabal's gone and the world's going through transition and everything's changing, this is going to be a major problem. You're absolutely right. I mean, information, they all say information and knowledge is power. Well, in the wrong hands, it can be very destructive. And it is, but you're absolutely right. There can be competitive advantage for certain organizations to be aware of what other organizations are doing. And can we say quite legitimately that there are going to be elements out there who will see this and pay the price for somebody to do this. Now, increasingly, of course, we hope that changes in the future. But how much has this gone on in the past that we're not aware of? Well, very much so. It's probably happened far more than any of us really ever care to imagine or realize. So, yeah, it's a massive, massive problem. Why I keep mentioning it, because it is that important. I mean, cybercrime, cyber terrorism is a huge problem going forward, and it's something that will fund terrorist organizations. I mean, we might drive ISIS out of Syria and Iraq and places like that. What's going to happen? And this feeds into something that's probably worth mentioning. And when we touched on this, when the whole kind of Trump's immigration ban bill came out, and I said it's because there are perceived direct threats against US people. And now the department, State Department said that they believe the US citizens are targets for terror groups. They could use traditional non-conventional weapons. They've included ISIS in that and their associates and those who were, inspired by such organizations. This is a reality. This isn't some cabal false flag anymore. You know, they could, they may do random attacks. They've listed soft targets, for want of a better word. They say hotels, parks, public transportation systems. That is a possibility. And I'm not trying to, frighten people by saying this, but the same thing happens in Europe. The risk is when they see they're losing, there's a risk of sporadic attacks happening across Europe, and they are starting to thwart a lot of those. So it's a reality, and that is one of the main reasons why Trump said, "Look, till we sort out how people come into our country via immigration from these countries, we want to make sure it works a two-way. The
Yeah.
nation that they're coming in from is sorted their end out, and we sort our end out. We're concerned about this, and this is a credible threat now. This isn't some kind of cabal made up fear campaign. There is a risk of this, and these sporadic terror attacks are something that could happen in the future. And I'm not trying to sensationalize it. Anyone who knows me, I do the exact opposite. But it's something that there is a real risk of that it could happen. And if the US government didn't take any steps to do that, the first people who are going to complain is they're going to turn around to Trump's administration and go, why didn't you deal with this? Why weren't you aware of this? Well, they're publicly telling everyone, we're aware of this. This is why we're doing things.
Hmm.
To make people aware of the fact there is a risk. Now, it may be a very low grade risk or something, maybe high, but something we can't just dismiss as fantasy, because what are these organizations? They're not going to just disappear overnight. Yeah, we'll starve the funding and they'll probably run out of steam relatively quickly in the sense of what they did in invading countries. But it doesn't mean that these terror cells aren't going to exist. We've had them in the past, and we've had them in Europe where they existed. The sporadic attacks do happen, and they're not always cabal-induced attacks either. They can just be random groups who have a particular desire to impose some view on a particular nation. So we do have to be a little bit careful that there is a risk of that happening.
Absolutely, 1000%. I mean, there's absolutely going to be organically created terrorism. Yeah, without a doubt, it's unavoidable. What else is going on in your radar, Paul? What else are you seeing in some of these big picture events that we should be mindful of?
Well, I think we don't often talk as well. In fact, I don't think we have. I mean, South Korea, the whole kind of thing now. Obviously, to put some context in this,
Yeah,
the
with President
president
Park.
Park, she's finally obviously been impeached, and now her
Terrible.
likely successor could be really interesting
Mm.
because from the comments he's come out with, he seems to be moving away from what we might call traditional US policy towards North Korea and China in that region. He once called for an end to kind of strict national security laws that exist in North Korea. I mean, the South Korean National Intelligence Service had to admit, we talk about Gmail accounts, they were spying on and hacking Gmail accounts of South Korean citizens. And interestingly, he's deeply skeptical about the THAAD. I don't know how you pronounce that, but that's obviously the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, which
Oh,
obviously
THAAD.
the
Yeah. The
THAAD is it? Okay,
yeah.
THAAD, great.
Hmm.
So he's kind of against that, despite and of course the fact is now there's this huge political hot potato where North Korea sets off some missiles to provoke a big reaction. Now, of course, the reality is North Korea isn't what everyone thinks it is. North Korea was actually a CIA project in isolation, isn't it? Now, how much influence does the CIA have in North Korea anymore is a good question. But I don't think it's any coincidence that the North Koreans start launching missiles and making all sorts of overt and covert threats and almost threatening the US in the process. So the US reacts. There's a big move, and okay, the THAAD system was supposed to be rolled out anyway, and it's not linked to the current aggravation of the situation. Well, that's what the US say. Okay, fair enough. The US is very keen to reassure Beijing it's purely a defensive matter. The Russians have got involved. Obviously, the Japanese are involved, and it's turning into this big, huge political hot potato. But the reality is, this is not who is trying. And what they're trying to do is the North Koreans. They just want to provoke a reaction, so somebody loses their patience, launches a missile, and creates a whole huge, conflict in that region in the world. But the reality is, there's probably meddling, sorry, somewhere in that process is some facet of the deep state intelligence services out coming out the US and out the West that's trying to provoke this reaction because they want something to occupy people's minds, create a major problem, because obviously they're losing serious traction in terms of the Middle East. And where else is there a major global conflict? Well, nowhere at the moment. But of course, you're going to drag the Chinese. The Chinese and the South Korean relations are deteriorating. Well, maybe if this new guy gets elected, then that will change. But China's already saying we're going to impose some economic constraints on South Korea. And Russia's obviously trying to find diplomatic solutions. They're talking to Japan and China about trying to just cool the whole situation down. But you can guarantee if we've had this before in the past, but it seems to be escalating at the moment. And I think the timing as ever is yet another example of a desperate, failing cabal, whatever system you want to call it, who's just trying to provoke a reaction. And all the Chinese and the South Koreans and the Japanese need to do is go, just don't fall for the bait, just ignore it. Let's just have cool heads, let it all settle down, because I don't think for 1 minute, and I don't want to tempt fate, I just don't see North Korea suddenly going, well, actually, we're going to launch a missile into South Korea, or we're going to launch a missile in other provocative way and actually hit, say, a US military facility, which they claim they're looking to do. And of course, the age-old problem with North Korea is when we look at how they want to impose sanctions on nations. I know, yeah, there is some sanctions have been imposed on North Korea. The question is, why have they never had military intervention in North Korea? They've got every reason to do so. They could easily have a UN Security Council resolution that would say we need to end it. There's your answer as to what the reality of North Korea is, and it's not some kind of rogue nation that is autonomous in that regard. Yes, to some extent is, but it does have some very strange covert operations that are actually ultimately running it. And the fact that the UN does nothing, just from my perspective, is just one clear indication of that.
Absolutely. I think I thought it was going to be kind of like a Dilma Rousseff situation with a Michael Temer in the wings. But I'm glad to see that it's not that this the front runner to replace her is not somebody who is towing the lines of Washington, so to speak, but is actually seeking real alternatives here. Another thing, also, speaking of Michael Temer, did you hear that he and his wife ran out of their homes? Did you hear about that?
No, I hadn't heard this. No.
Oh, well, Mike, here's the news for you, Paul. Michael
Hmm.
Temer and his wife quickly moved out of their newly purchased mansion because he believes it was haunted by ghosts. I kid you not. You can Google this. And it's funny because I was thinking to myself, maybe the CIA had it all wiretapped and he had to run out of there. That's Michael Temer.
Do you know? Well, what could you say? Well, you can't say anything really. I mean, it's just. I mean, I think
Here's an article from the Independent. Brazilian President Michael Temer moves out of official residence because of ghosts.
I mean, you think they could have come up with a more plausible reason why he's really moved out? You know, I want to say there's dry rot in it or something. I don't. I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it?
He should have said there was mold, but it says Mr. Temer
Yeah.
and his wife Marcella are moving back to the vice presidential residence where they lived with their 7-year-old son. He told Vieja magazine, I felt something strange there. I wasn't able to sleep right from the first night. The energy wasn't good. Marcella felt the same thing.
We better hope the ghosts don't follow him back to his old residence.
Yeah, exactly.
But
Unreal.
I think something else probably worth mentioning was this whole thing where Sessions said, you know, there's 46 U.S. attorneys appointed by Obama, and I
Mhm.
want them all to hand in their resignation, and this is normal policy and procedure.
Right.
Now, I know there's the issue of, well, you know, somebody didn't want to resign, and then they said, well, you know, you're going to have to sack me, and then there's the whole issue of that. This is just normal procedure. I don't think anyone should be too totally alarmed. And I know there's arguments that says, well, you know, some of these US attorneys are doing a great job, and yes, they probably were, but this is normal procedure. I think again, it's the whole attack on Sessions. The big fear from the cabal's perspective, or deep state, whatever you want to call it, is Sessions is hell bent on removing every aspect of corruption that goes on in the US in terms of Washington and everywhere else. And there's a lot of you know, comments and suggestions coming out that he's happy to put independent people in to resolve problems. This is why they want rid of him, because they can't buy him off and he's not corruptible. So, and he's represents a big problem because he's going to tackle all the major problem, which is the last thing the cabal wants to do in terms of the US or anywhere else, but particularly with regards to the US. He's going to open a can of worms, and that can of worms is going to spread across Europe, particularly when you look at the really nasty aspects to do with trafficking, paedophilia, and all that sort of thing. Because that's not just going to stop at in the US, that's going to spread across Europe and right the way across the world, because there is obviously a huge network involved in that regard. So there's a lot of reasons why they don't want Sessions there, but of course that whole thing about the Russians is another pile of absolute nonsense, and that seems to have died a death because, again, the problem is it's like crying wolf. You can cry wolf so many times in the end that when the wolf comes, if it even does, people just ignore it. And I think this whole push about Russia, even if there was some truth in anything, which I don't see there's any evidence that,
Yeah.
people wouldn't believe it anymore because they're sick to death of, oh, it's the Russians. I mean, the Russians are responsible for everything, and people have had enough of that.
Well, they did have a picture of Trump during the campaign trail. He was in close proximity to a bottle of Russian salad dressing. I think there's some collusion there, Paul.
Oh my word! I mean, did he have a bottle of vodka on the table as well? I mean,
I think, yeah, no, he doesn't drink, so
no, that's true. He doesn't. So yeah, but maybe maybe it was one of his guests, or and maybe
caviar.
it was yeah, and caviar, yeah, of course, and
Yeah,
maybe some nice Russian soup while he was at it.
yeah. These people are unbelievable, man. What do you think about the firing of Preet Bharara? I mean, I thought this guy
Well,
was a good guy. What's your take on this?
yeah. I mean, I kind of without mention should have mentioned, but yeah, of course. I mean, that seems people will say, well, that seems a little bit odd because clearly he was doing what he. I think. And I don't say it's a personal reflection on him. I think the problem is there's this idea we just need a clean sweep, and anyone associated with the Obama administration's got to go. No disrespect to the guy, because you're absolutely right. When you look at what he's done and things he's been involved in, he's very much trying to to clean up and do a really good job. But I think it's just the price he's paid is that he's part of the Obama administration, and I think there's that much kind of concern about anyone who has any affiliation, and in his case, it's probably not applicable. But unfortunately, he's had to pay the price. And in reality, when he was asked to resign, he probably should have just said, "I'm going to resign," because he knew full well that if he didn't resign, they'd sack him. And what's that going to prove? It doesn't prove anything. I mean, yeah, it makes the news headlines for a day, and in about a week's time, no one will remember who he was
Correct.
in that regard. But I don't think there's any reason to suggest this is an idea that, well, they're removing one of the good guys, so therefore they're trying to not allow someone to do their job. I don't see that to be the case. I mean, yeah, it's very unfortunate, but in all these situations, there's always going to be casualties who shouldn't be casualties. And I mean, Trump said as much that there's going to be times when we make decisions and it's going to put some people's nose out of joint. But unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do if it resolves 99 of the problems. Then if there's one that doesn't quite work out, well, there's not a lot we can do. And let's be honest, what would you have done? Say, well, we want you 45 to go, but we want to keep you on.
Yeah.
And people would have said, hang on, what? And he would have probably caused major problems if he'd done so. And who knows in the future, maybe he'll come back in some capacity. I mean, it's rather like, what's Michael Flynn doing now? Is Michael Flynn not doing anything with the Trump administration? Well, I strongly suspect that's not the case. He probably very much is doing stuff, but in a far different role and not in an obvious way. But I mean, so maybe, that's the problem. And in reality, he should have probably just, when they said resign, he should have just said, okay, understand the situation, or at least got on the phone and said, look, what's the deal? What's going on? But no, I don't think we should read anything too sinister into why he's gone. But it's probably in reality, yeah, it's very unfortunate he has. But there's always going to be this problem when you have a handover administration, and particularly, unfortunately, what the consequences of what Obama seems to be doing now in terms of, instead of being an ex-president just walking away into the sunset and doing whatever ex-presidents do, we know he's been associated with organizations who seem to be having a hand in trying to stir up anything they can with regards to Trump in terms of what he's doing and also just stoking up in amongst the people that Trump's unpopular. But of course, that's now turning. More and more people are seeing, in favor of Trump. His popularity is growing. And why they had an opinion poll, and I'm not sure how much store we can place in an opinion poll, but Clinton's kind of opinion ratings falling off a cliff edge now, and that throughout has been a huge swing in terms of what's going on. But I think the problem is it's just a legacy that the Obama administration's tainted in all regards. And yeah, there was major problems and whatever anyone wants to say, but you're always going to there are some good people, no doubt, in the Obama administration who are trying to do the right thing, and unfortunately, there's going to be those casualties.
Well, Hillary Clinton's popularity is on the rise. Did you hear this, Paul? Her unfavorability rating is 58% when they were trying to, do some, put the feelers out there in order to see if this woman could actually run for New York City mayor. Close to 60% of people don't like her. So her popularity is really rising.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, well, instead of just disappearing and she chooses to do otherwise, I mean, yeah, it's just not a reality. But that's the thing. I mean, if you think in a very short space of time, there was the people obviously voted Trump in, but there was a lot of hostility, and that hostility is starting to go away, because people are seeing the realization of what he's trying to do. But we come back to the point: his fundamental job at the moment is to take a wrecking ball to, if you want to call it the deep state, let's call it that. And the deep state is in serious decline. Yeah, there is the move in the opposite direction through the Trump administration to solve the problem, but they're also in huge decline, and they're suffering hammer blow after hammer blow. But they're like a boxer. They're going to take a lot of blows to knock them over, but they're getting punch drunk by the week, and we're seeing this. And there's no doubt about it. The whole CIA revelations is exactly part of that. Yeah. I mean, the reality, it's the public perception as well. People are going to start going, hang on, Trump said these things and now this is coming out. Oh, hang on. Now we're hearing that, perhaps it isn't the Russians after all, because the CIA were duping the signature. Therefore, it might well have not been the Russians. It's all sowing the seeds of making people realize, because at the end of the day, if he has the kind of approval rating that Putin has, it's going to make his job a lot easier in the US than if he's scratching around with the approval rating of Hollande, for example, as the opposite extreme. But it's that kind of thing. It's a war of winning the minds of the American people as much as anything, and anything that will benefit him in that regard is providing he's doing the right things. Of course, it's going to be hugely of benefit to him, particularly and his administration. Whilst we've got the backdrop of the deep state doing everything they can to remove him, I'm still getting people saying to me, "Well, he's obviously cabal. He's obviously a neocon. He's obviously, well." And the question I come back to them is, well, he's the only American president I've ever known in recent history who all these people are desperate to get rid of him. If he's so much on their side and so much part of what they want to do, why are they trying to get rid of him? And of course, you don't get a response, but that's
you get a response. The reality. The response is, oh, it's just psychological. It's a psyop.
Yeah, okay, it's a psyop that's it's a psyop that's so confusing that even the people organizing it don't even know what it means.
That's very true.
I mean, it's like a psyop that's spun on its head and just confuses everybody to the point no one understands it. But no, I mean that's the reality. But there's still elements out there who are trying to convince people that, I mean, because it's like, well, he's employing this person who once worked for Goldman Sachs and all this stuff. I mean, again, it's just utter nonsense. And I know we reiterate this, but it's an important point. The world's changing rapidly. If the world wasn't changing rapidly, fair enough. But people have got to stop framing everything in this old paradigm that, well, Seriously. this is how it was and nothing's changing. Well, if that was the case, we wouldn't see these huge global changes. And we only have to look at the Middle East, look at Turkey's complete 180 and how it flipped, and now it sees Russia as its greatest ally when a year ago Russia was its sworn enemy. The world's changing rapidly, and we have to look at everything differently. And going forward, if something happens,
otherwise,
first thing everyone,
otherwise we'll wind up like Netanyahu, 2,500 years ago.
Exactly, and that's the point. We just need to, when things happen, and in some chronological order, ask ourselves, why is it happening? Why is it happening now, and what are the consequences of that? And we can often, no matter who we are, draw or come to the conclusion of exactly what is going on, and that's something I'd encourage everybody to do. When something happens, why is it happening now? What's the context? Because at the moment, a lot of things that are happening are not just happening randomly; they're happening for a reason. And there's no doubt, there is a war going on inside the CIA as well themselves. There's somebody in the CIA undoubtedly leaked the information indirectly. There's no doubt about it. So the question then is that everyone in the CIA aren't bad people, and there's different groups and branches of the CIA who are all at war with each other anyway. And ultimately they're all at war with Trump, but there's elements within each of those branches who aren't at war with Trump, and somebody's decided enough's enough. And there is a wrecking ball, but you can't take the CIA down rapidly. But I think if they don't start to play ball, then the WikiLeaks revelations, as we said earlier, will become more and more prevalent. And there is definitely a move to take them down and that may sound like a bold statement, but that's exactly what is going on. And it's not just the CIA. It's you could say it's the NSA, anything else, any other intelligence organization, any other facet of the US government, whatever it might be. If there's people inside any of the State Department, there's people inside the Department of Justice, anyone who's not playing ball and doing their job properly is going to get fired. And if they're doing anything illegal, they're going to get adjudicated in due course. But don't expect everything to happen overnight, because it's a hugely complex problem. And you don't want to fire the wrong person or decide to send someone, commit someone to trial and then find out that your evidence falls apart and your credibility is kind of in the toilet, so to speak. So it's a hugely difficult problem to address, and it's an age-old cliche, but everyone needs to be patient, because eventually it will come good, but it's not going to happen overnight. It could take months. It'll take probably till we get to the other side and the world's the way it should be. This could take years, and that people shouldn't be discouraged by that, because we see progress all the time, but it's not an overnight sensation. And I think a lot of people have been duped into believing that somehow someone waves a magic wand and the world all changes. Well, it's far more complicated than that, because you need to factor in 7 billion people in the world. And how are they all going to react to all these changes? How are they going to respond? What's going to happen? You bring out new technology. Well, you have to measure how you do that, because you don't want to end up making 30 million people in a nation unemployed because you decide, well, we're going to roll out this technology. What do these people do for a living? So you have to have a kind of strategic viewpoint as to how you address all these problems and roll them out. And you can't just be ham-fisted, because you're going to, as much as we want to prevent the loss of life and the damage to people's lives, which has happened for decades and beyond, we also don't want to make the problem even worse by making snap decisions in the process.
Absolutely, 1000%. I agree. Paul, we're at the end of the broadcast, man. Why don't you give out your website, your YouTube channel, how people could follow you, and your social media, and the importance of your subscriber services that you offer as well?
Well, first off, thanks for all your support, and you've plugged us a lot, and we're very grateful for that. Well, obviously the website's the Sirius report. That's Sirius. We put a lot of free articles on that. We've got a little section called News Updates, where we put some snippets of information over above what we obviously put in the podcast. Now, the podcast is obviously on the premium content page on the website. That's $4.75 a month. You get 5 podcasts a week, roughly 10 to 15 minutes each. It's kind of an in-depth analysis. We put intelligence in there. We piece all the various puzzles together and make sense of what's going on. And I think, without blowing our own trumpet, I think we do a really good job at doing that. We like everyone to subscribe. We get lots of really great feedback from people saying, how much they enjoy it. So, we do like to encourage people to subscribe. And I don't think $4.75 a month is a huge amount of money either in the process. We obviously got the Twitter page at the Sirius Report. We also have the YouTube channel. That's the London Paul channel. And occasionally we were going to have free, obviously, little video clips on there. I did one about, obviously, to do with global real estate and the reality of what that is. And that's free. Everyone can listen to that. And that really gives people a kind of indication of when we look at certain subjects and we drill it down into detail as to what's going on. And obviously, we've got the Facebook page, the Sirius Report, and there's one that obviously if people can subscribe to, if they're obviously subscribed to the premium content. And I think really that's about as much as we can say. But thanks to all the people who support us already, and thanks for all the encouragement, because without the feedback, we wouldn't know if we're doing the right thing. And the important thing is that we are doing the right thing and people appreciate it. Otherwise, I'd just be on one-way transmission, and what's the point of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for being on. And again, guys, subscribe to his podcast. It is an intelligence briefing that you need to understand of what the heck's going on in the world. We are big fans of Paul's work here at Rogue Money, so please check it out, support the work that he's doing. I find it absolutely vital for us to have this information. With that being said, guys, you can follow us on roguemoney.net, follow us on Twitter at the Rogue Money and the Rogue Money Facebook page. And with that being said, we are all, I guess we'll wait until next week as more and more things get divulged and come to the surface. Paul, when we started this thing, we didn't realize that. We knew we were going to be busy, but my God, this is really busy.
Well, yeah, the amount of it, just information I have to look through on a daily basis, and I cross-reference, analyze it and understand it. It's just exponentially growing by the day. And yes, some of it's rubbish and some of it is a bit half-baked, so we have to sift through and find out what's reality. But yeah, it is just growing by the day and by the week, and it is huge, and it's what we expect. But I think the acceleration of this is taking even us by surprise to some extent.
Absolutely. And with that being said, we're all set. CJ, take it away, buddy.